My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 32 years old, and I'll never forget the sting of that locked conference room door. It was the day of the Q3 profit-sharing announcement, the one where the bonuses for the Phoenix project were being handed out. My project, the one I'd bled for, worked 80-hour weeks on, the one everyone initially said was impossible. I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration from within, the clinking of glasses, the forced laughter of my boss, Mr. Henderson, and the smug tones of Mark, his golden boy, the one who'd somehow become the face of my success. They were in there, carving up the spoils of my labor, and I was deliberately, pointedly, left out. I remember standing there, my presentation notes for the project's next phase still clutched in my hand, feeling a cold wave of humiliation wash over me. It wasn't just about the money, though that was a significant part of it, especially after all the sacrifices I'd made. It was the blatant disrespect, the absolute erasure of my contribution, as if I were a ghost in my own career. Just an hour before, I'd seen the email reminder for the Phoenix Project Core Team Profit Share Celebration. My name, conspicuously absent from the invitee list. I'd even tried to approach Henderson's assistant, Laura, asking if there had been some mistake. She just gave me that pitying look, the one that says, "You know how things are around here," and mumbled something about the list being finalized by Mr. Henderson himself. Mr. Henderson had even walked right past me in the hallway, not 10 minutes before the meeting started. He was with Mark, both of them laughing about something, their expensive suits practically radiating arrogance. He made direct eye contact with me, a fleeting, dismissive glance, before a smirk played on his lips as he turned his head and continued towards the conference room. He knew. They all knew. They thought I was just a workhorse, someone to generate ideas, solve the impossible problems, and then step aside meekly when it was time for the rewards and recognition. They assumed I'd just take it, maybe shed a few frustrated tears in the bathroom, perhaps lodge a futile complaint with HR that would go nowhere, and then quietly, defeatedly, go back to my desk and start working on their next big idea. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly fathomed in their self-congratulatory bubble, was that while they were toasting their success with cheap champagne, I had a different kind of document secured in my briefcase. Not profit projections, not performance reviews, but official government-sealed patent certificates. 3 of them, to be exact, all bearing my name as the sole inventor. The core technology, the innovative algorithm, the very bedrock that made the Phoenix project not just fly, but soar into unprecedented profitability? That was mine. Legally, indisputably, irrevocably mine. They were about to discover that excluding me from a meeting was a trivial oversight compared to the monumental blunder of underestimating me. They were about to find out that sidelining Sarah Chen was the most expensive mistake of their professional lives. Have you ever poured your heart and soul into a project, dedicated countless nights and weekends, only to be completely sidelined and ignored when it came to the rewards and recognition? Tell me about your experience in the comments below. It's time we shared our stories and showed each other that we're not alone in these battles for what we rightfully deserve. And hey, if you're new here and this is already resonating with you, consider subscribing for more stories where the underestimated finally get their due. This wasn't just going to be a correction of an oversight, it was going to be a public, undeniable reckoning. And honestly, a very small, very vindicated part of me couldn't wait to see the looks on their arrogant faces when the truth finally came to light. They thought they were celebrating a victory. They had no idea they were actually attending the prelude to their own downfall. This pattern of being overlooked, of having my work subtly or sometimes blatantly co-opted, wasn't new. It had been the wallpaper of my career at Innovatech Solutions for the past 5 years. When I first joined, fresh-faced and brimming with ideas, I thought hard work and talent were the only currencies that mattered. Mr. Henderson, Richard Henderson, our department head, even seemed impressed by my initial projects. He'd nod, say, "Good work, Chen," and I'd feel a small thrill of validation. But then Mark Jennings was hired, a charming, smooth-talking guy who seemed to spend more time schmoozing with Henderson over golf and expensive lunches than actually understanding the technicalities of our work. Slowly, insidiously, the dynamic shifted. I remember the Aura project, my first significant proposal. I'd spent months on the research, developing a new client interface I was convinced would revolutionize our user engagement. I presented it in a team meeting. Henderson was non-committal. Mark, who'd barely glanced at my pre-circulated brief, piped up with, "Interesting concept, Sarah, but perhaps if we tweak the back-end integration this way," and proceeded to rephrase my core mechanism, adding a superficial flourish. Henderson's eyes lit up. "Now, that's thinking, Mark. Why don't you take the lead on developing that? Sarah, you can support Mark with the technical details." Support Mark. I felt like a stagehand being told to help the lead actor who'd just stolen my lines. My detailed proposal, my innovative framework, suddenly became Mark's initiative. I'd see him in meetings, presenting my slides, my data, with a confident air, while I was relegated to answering technical queries, a glorified footnote. Then there was the disastrous Titan account rescue. Our biggest client was about to walk because of a series of blunders made by Mark's team, a team he supposedly led. Deadlines were missed, deliverables were shoddy, panic set in. Henderson, looking pale, called me into his office late one Friday. "Sarah, I know this isn't your project, but we're in a real bind. Mark's, well, he's overwhelmed. Can you see what you can do? Discreetly?" Discreetly. That was the key word. I pulled 3 all-nighters, recoding faulty modules, streamlining processes, basically rebuilding the entire back end. I submitted the corrected functional system at 6 a.m. on Monday. At the 9 a.m. client meeting, Mark presented his team's recovery plan, full of my solutions, and basked in the client's relieved praise. Henderson clapped him on the back. "Knew you could pull it out of the fire, Mark." My reward? A curt, "Thanks for the assist, Chen," in a follow-up email from Henderson, CCing Mark. No mention of the sleepless nights. No acknowledgement of the save. It felt like my contributions were written in invisible ink. The promotion to senior analyst was another bitter pill. I had more experience, consistently higher performance reviews, the parts Henderson couldn't easily attribute to Mark anyway, and a deeper understanding of our core technologies than anyone else in the running, including Mark. But when the announcement came, it was Mark's name that was called. Henderson's explanation to me, when I dared to ask for feedback, was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. "Sarah, you're an invaluable technical asset, truly. But Mark has, well, he has a certain executive presence. He's better at the client-facing optics." Executive presence. Was that code for being male, for schmoozing, for taking credit for others' work? I remember nodding. A cold fury building inside me, a fury I had to carefully mask. My invaluable technical skills were apparently best kept in the back room, like a well-oiled but unsightly engine. And so we come to the Phoenix project. This wasn't just another project, it was my magnum opus. The initial concept, a predictive analytics engine for financial markets, was something I'd been tinkering with in my own time for years, long before I even pitched it. When I finally presented the preliminary framework, Henderson was, as usual, skeptical. "It's ambitious, Sarah, very ambitious. Perhaps too ambitious for our current resources." Mark predictably chimed in, "Yeah, sounds a bit out there. Not sure the board will go for something so theoretical." It was only when I showed them the initial simulation results, the ones that hinted at massive potential profits, that Henderson's ears pricked up. Suddenly, it was an exciting, bold new direction. And just as suddenly, Mark was appointed project lead. My designation? Lead technical architect. Henderson's rationale was that Mark had the vision to sell it upstairs and to potential investors, while I would handle the complex build. The next 18 months were a blur of intense work for me. I designed the entire system architecture, wrote the foundational algorithms, debugged Mark's team's clumsy attempts at module integration, and solved every single critical problem that threatened to derail the project. Mark, in the meantime, was busy. Busy taking Henderson to strategy lunches. Busy presenting my progress reports, rebranded with his name on the front, to the executive committee. Busy giving interviews to internal newsletters about his groundbreaking project. I was the brilliant mind behind the scenes, a convenient, faceless entity. Whenever I tried to gently assert my role, To ensure my contributions were accurately documented, Henderson would placate me with, "Sarah, we're a team. Credit is shared. Don't worry about titles. Focus on the results." Or, my personal favorite, "You're not one for the spotlight, are you, Sarah? Some people just prefer to let their work speak for itself." He said it as if it were a compliment, as if my silence was a virtue he was commending, rather than a necessity forced upon me by their systematic erasure. The sheer audacity of it, the constant gaslighting, made my blood boil. But I learned to channel that fire, not into outward confrontation that would only get me labeled as difficult or not a team player, but into meticulous documentation and a quiet, unyielding resolve. Every line of code, every design document, every breakthrough, I kept my own pristine records. They thought I was just coding. I was also building my case. Amidst the daily grind of being Henderson's and Mark's invisible engine, there was one person who saw through the charade. Dr. Evelyn Hayes. She was a senior consultant, brought in occasionally for high-level strategic reviews, a legend in the tech industry known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense attitude. She wasn't a permanent fixture at Innovatech, which perhaps gave her the clarity and courage to see things as they were, unclouded by internal politics. I first encountered Dr. Hayes during a particularly grueling phase of the Phoenix project. We were hitting a major roadblock with the predictive modeling, something even I was struggling to crack. Mark, of course, was panicking, but his idea of problem-solving was to schedule more meetings to brainstorm synergies, which usually meant him pacing around while I explained the technical complexities he barely grasped. Henderson had brought Dr. Hayes in to provide an external perspective on why Mark's team was facing delays. During one of these progress meetings, where Mark was doing his usual song and dance, vaguely outlining the problem using my technical terms incorrectly, Dr. Hayes, who had been listening intently with an unreadable expression, suddenly cut him off mid-sentence. "Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority, "with all due respect, it sounds like you're describing the symptoms, not the core issue. Ms. Chen," she turned to me, her gaze direct and piercing, "you've been quiet. You're the lead architect. What's your diagnostic?" I was so taken aback by being directly addressed, by someone actually wanting my unvarnished technical opinion in front of Mark and Henderson, that I stammered for a moment. But then I saw a flicker of something in Dr. Hayes's eyes. Not pity, but genuine inquiry. So, I took a deep breath and laid it out. The specific algorithmic bottleneck, the data integrity issues we were facing due to a rushed module implementation, one Mark had pushed for against my advice, and my proposed solution, which involved a significant but necessary refactoring of a core component. Mark immediately started to bluster. "Well, Sarah, that sounds very drastic. We need to consider the timelines." Henderson, looking uncomfortable, began to waffle about managing expectations. But Dr. Hayes held up a hand, silencing them both. She looked at me. "Your proposed refactoring, Ms. Chen. What's the estimated time frame, and what's your confidence level in its success?" I gave her the realistic estimates, outlining the risks and mitigation strategies I'd already considered. She listened, nodding slowly, asking a few incredibly insightful follow-up questions that showed she understood the technical depth instantly. At the end of my explanation, she simply said, "That sounds like the most viable path forward. Mr. Henderson, I suggest you let Ms. Chen proceed with her plan. And Mr. Jennings, perhaps your role here is to ensure she has all the resources and none of the interference she needs to execute it." The air in the room was thick with unspoken resentment from Mark and Henderson, but they couldn't openly defy Dr. Hayes, not with her reputation. After that meeting, Dr. Hayes sought me out. She found me in the small, windowless office they'd assigned me, hunched over my terminal. "Sarah," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "you have a remarkable mind. Don't let these peacocks diminish your light." She then said something that stuck with me, something that became a quiet mantra during the long months that followed. "In my experience, true innovation rarely comes from the loudest voice in the room. It comes from the most persistent, the most insightful. Document everything. Protect your intellectual property. Your work has significant value, far beyond what this company currently seems to recognize. It was the first time anyone at that level, anyone at all in that company, had explicitly acknowledged not just my technical skill, but the injustice of my situation. She didn't offer to fight my battles for me. She knew that wasn't her role, and perhaps knew it wouldn't be as effective as me finding my own way. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable: validation, and a crucial piece of advice that would ultimately arm me for the confrontation to come. She saw the game being played, and in her own subtle way, coached me on how to not just play it, but to eventually change the rules. Knowing I had someone of her stature who saw my true worth, even if she wasn't there day to day, was like having a secret shield. It strengthened my resolve to keep pushing, keep innovating, and, most importantly, keep preparing for the day I could finally claim what was mine. Her words about protecting my intellectual property were what planted the seed for the patent applications. She made me realize that just doing the work wasn't enough. I had to own it, legally and unequivocally. Dr. Hayes's advice about protecting my intellectual property echoed in my mind long after she left. Document everything. Protect your IP. It wasn't just about keeping records anymore. It was about ownership. The Phoenix Project was built on 3 core innovations, 3 unique algorithmic approaches that I had conceptualized and developed from scratch. These weren't incremental improvements on existing company tech. They were genuinely novel. And I realized, with a chilling clarity, that if I didn't act, Innovatech, under Henderson and Mark's stewardship, would undoubtedly claim them as company property, with Mark's name likely plastered all over any internal filings. So, my silent rise began not with climbing the corporate ladder they controlled, but by building my own unshakable foundation outside their purview. While they saw me as the diligent, quiet coder, heads down in my cubicle, I was meticulously preparing patent applications. This was entirely new territory for me. I spent my evenings and weekends poring over intellectual property law, learning about patent claims, prior art searches, and the excruciatingly detailed documentation required. I used my own savings to hire a specialized patent attorney, someone with no ties to Innovatech, to guide me through the process. We had clandestine meetings in coffee shops far from the office, discussing the nuances of my inventions. The first hurdle was proving novelty and non-obviousness. This meant hours spent searching patent databases, academic papers, and industry publications to ensure my algorithms were truly unique. My attorney was initially skeptical, as many corporate inventions are derivative. But as I walked him through the mathematical underpinnings and the unique architecture of my systems, his skepticism turned into excitement. "Sarah," he'd said after reviewing my 3rd core concept, "this is genuinely groundbreaking. If these algorithms perform as you say, they're not just patentable, they're potentially revolutionary in your field." While Mark was busy taking credit in executive briefings for milestones achieved, milestones I had actually delivered, I was on the phone with patent examiners, clarifying technical details, defending the uniqueness of my claims. There were moments of profound frustration. The bureaucracy, the endless revisions, the sheer exhaustion of working my demanding day job, and then diving into this complex legal battle by night. There were times I wanted to give up, to just let them have it, to resign myself to being the uncredited genius. But then I'd remember Henderson's smirk, Mark's smug pronouncements, the casual dismissal of my work, and that cold fury would reignite, fueling my determination. I kept this entirely secret. Not a soul at Innovatech knew. My colleagues saw me working late, but they assumed it was just Sarah being Sarah, the dedicated workhorse. Mark would occasionally drop by my desk with a patronizing, "Still burning the midnight oil, Chen? Don't burn yourself out. We need you to keep the engine running." He had no idea the real engine I was building was for myself. Henderson, if he noticed my long hours, probably just saw it as me diligently executing Mark's vision. The irony was almost unbearable at times. The day the first patent was officially granted, I remember sitting in my car, holding the official certificate, and just crying. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and a burgeoning sense of power. It was tangible proof. My name, Sarah Chen, listed as the inventor, not Innovatech Solutions, not Mark Jennings. Me. 2 more followed in the subsequent months, covering all the core intellectual property that made the Phoenix Project the success it was becoming. Each certificate was a shield, a weapon, a validation of years of unrecognized labor. I stored the originals in a safe deposit box and kept meticulously organized digital and physical copies. I continued to perform my duties at Innovatech with the same diligence, delivering the technical solutions that made the Phoenix Project exceed all profit expectations. Mark and Henderson grew bolder in their self-congratulation as the revenue numbers climbed. They had no idea that the true ownership of the Golden Goose resided not with the company, but with the quiet woman they so consistently undervalued and were about to exclude from their celebration. My silent rise wasn't about promotions or public accolades within Innovatech's toxic system. It was about securing irrefutable legal ownership of my creations. It was about preparing the chessboard for a game they didn't even know they were playing. And I was about to make my move. If this story of quiet preparation and fighting for what's yours resonates with you, hit that like button to show your support. It really helps more people find these stories of turning the tables. What would you have done in my shoes, knowing the injustice, but also having to play the long game? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I waited outside that conference room, the muffled sounds of their premature celebration a grating soundtrack to my resolve. I let them enjoy their champagne and self-congratulations for a good 15 minutes. I wanted them comfortable, complacent, deep in their narrative of triumph. In my briefcase, nestled amongst my usual work items, were pristine notarized copies of the 3 patent certificates, along with a concisely worded letter from my attorney outlining my intellectual property rights and a proposal for a licensing agreement. A very, very expensive licensing agreement. Finally, when I judged the moment to be right, just as I heard Henderson's voice booming about Mark's stellar leadership and record-breaking profits, I took a deep breath, smoothed down my jacket, and knocked. Firmly. The laughter inside paused. There was a moment of confused silence, then the scrape of a chair. The door opened a crack, and Laura, Henderson's assistant, peered out, her eyes widening slightly when she saw me. "Sarah, the meeting is, private." "I understand, Laura," I said, my voice calm and even, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. "But I have some critical information regarding the Phoenix Project that Mr. Henderson and the team need to be aware of immediately. It pertains directly to the project's ongoing viability and, indeed, its legality." I used those words, viability, legality, very deliberately. Laura looked flustered, glanced back into the room, then reluctantly opened the door wider. "Mr. Henderson, Sarah Chen is here. She says it's critical." The scene inside was exactly as I'd imagined. Henderson beaming at the head of the table, Mark beside him looking insufferably pleased with himself, a handful of other senior managers and a few of Mark's sycophantic team members looking expectant. Champagne flutes were raised. My sudden appearance, uninvited and unexpected, cast an immediate pall over the celebratory mood. Henderson's smile tightened. "Sarah, this is a closed meeting. Whatever it is, it can wait." "I'm afraid it can't, Mr. Henderson," I replied, stepping fully into the room, my gaze sweeping over their surprised faces. "It concerns the intellectual property upon which the Phoenix Project is built," Mark scoffed. "Intellectual property? Sarah, we all know you did great technical work, but the IP belongs to Innovatech. That's standard." He even had the audacity to wink at one of his cronies. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the suddenly silent room, "that's where you and Innovatech are mistaken." I walked calmly to the large mahogany conference table, opened my briefcase, and took out the 3 patent certificates and the letter from my attorney. I laid them down, one by one, in front of Henderson. The official seals, the bold declaration of Inventor Sarah Chen, were unmistakable. "These," I announced, "are the United States patents for the core algorithmic innovations that drive the Phoenix Project. Patent number 10-whatever for the predictive modeling engine. Patent number 11-something else for the dynamic risk assessment framework. And patent number 12 you get the idea, for the adaptive learning interface. All 3 issued in my name, as the sole inventor." The silence in the room was no longer just surprised. It was stunned. Henderson, who had been reaching for his champagne flute, froze mid-motion. His face, moments before ruddy with celebratory cheer, began to pale. Mark's smug expression literally fell from his face, replaced by a look of utter disbelief, then dawning horror. He actually stammered, But how? The company, I interjected smoothly, was under the impression that these were developments of existing corporate IP, or perhaps work for hire. However, these innovations were conceptualized and substantially developed by me, independently, prior to their full incorporation into the Phoenix Project under company direction, and crucially, filed and granted under my own name and expense. My employment contract, which I have reviewed thoroughly with my legal counsel, does not assign pre-existing, independently patented inventions to Innovatech without explicit, separate agreement. I let that sink in. I then placed my attorney's letter on top of the patents. This letter outlines the situation and proposes a path forward. Essentially, Innovatech Solutions is currently utilizing my patented technology without a license. To continue to do so, and thus for the Phoenix Project to continue generating these record-breaking profits you're celebrating, Innovatech will need to secure a licensing agreement from me, the patent holder. The proposed terms are in the letter. I believe you'll find them reflective of the technology's value. Henderson finally found his voice, though it was a choked, strangled version of its usual boom. This is outrageous, Chen. This is some kind of trick. It's not a trick, Mr. Henderson, I said, my gaze unwavering. It's patent law, and it's the direct result of my work, my innovation, and my foresight to protect it when it was clear no one else here valued its true origin. I looked directly at Mark, whose face was now a ghastly shade of white. You were so busy taking credit, Mark. You never bothered to understand what you were actually taking credit for. The other managers around the table were shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Henderson and Mark, some looking at me with a new, dawning respect, others with sheer shock. The champagne flutes sat untouched. The celebratory atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Perhaps, I continued, my voice still calm but now carrying an undeniable edge of triumph, you'd like to review these documents before you continue your profit-sharing calculations, because as it stands, a significant portion of those profits are directly attributable to intellectual property that, as of this moment, Innovatech does not own and is using illegally. I paused, letting the full weight of my words land. I'll be in my office. I expect we'll need to schedule a rather more inclusive meeting to discuss this, with legal counsel present, of course. I turned then, without waiting for a response, and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a scene of utter consternation. The silence that followed my departure was, to my ears, far more satisfying than any applause. They had wanted to lock me out. I had just handed them the keys to their own cage. The aftermath of my revelation was swift and chaotic, at least from what I heard. Apparently, Henderson's face went from white to a dangerous shade of purple. Mark just sat there, utterly deflated, like a punctured balloon. The profit-sharing celebration ended abruptly, replaced by hushed, panicked whispers and urgent phone calls to Innovatech's legal department. It wasn't long, maybe an hour, before Laura, looking stressed and avoiding my eyes, came to my office to summon me to an urgent meeting with Henderson, the head of legal, Ms. Albright, and much to my satisfaction, a very subdued Mark. This time, the meeting wasn't in the plush conference room they'd excluded me from, but in Ms. Albright's more sterile, intimidating office. The power dynamic had palpably shifted. Ms. Albright, a sharp woman I'd had minimal dealings with before, was all business. She had my patent documents and my attorney's letter spread out before her. Henderson was attempting to look indignant, but mostly just looked like a man who'd swallowed a hornet's nest. Mark looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Ms. Chen, Ms. Albright began, her tone measured. We are reviewing these documents. This is an unexpected development. Unexpected for you, perhaps, Ms. Albright, I replied coolly. For me, it's the culmination of a great deal of work and foresight. Henderson tried to interject. This is insubordination. She deliberately withheld this information. Ms. Albright cut him off with a sharp glance. Richard, please, let me handle this. She turned back to me. Your attorney's proposed licensing fees are substantial. They reflect the substantial profits the Phoenix Project is generating due to my patented technology, I stated simply. Profits from which I was, until very recently, entirely excluded from sharing, despite being the architect of the core technology. I let my gaze linger on Henderson and Mark for a moment. The next few days were a whirlwind of negotiations. Innovatech's legal team tried every angle. They questioned the timing of my patent filings, the scope of my claims, the interpretation of my employment contract. My attorney, bless his meticulous soul, was ready for every single argument. He had a documented timeline of my independent development, proof of when I engaged him, and a clear legal standing. They tried to lowball me on the licensing fees. We held firm. They hinted at legal battles. My attorney calmly pointed out the strength of my patents and the potential for countersuits for willful infringement, which could treble the damages. During one particularly tense negotiation, Henderson, clearly at the end of his tether, actually tried to appeal to my loyalty to the company. Sarah, surely you see this is damaging to Innovatech. We've been good to you. I almost laughed. Good to me, Mr. Henderson? Was it good when my ideas were consistently credited to Mark? Was it good when I was repeatedly passed over for promotions I deserved? Was it good when I was left out of a meeting celebrating the profits from my innovation while you and Mark toasted your success? My voice was low, but each word was laced with the frustration I'd suppressed for years. My loyalty is to fairness and to the recognition of my work. Something Innovatech, under your leadership, has consistently failed to provide. Henderson blanched. Ms. Albright quickly steered the conversation back to the legal practicalities. The resolution, when it finally came, was immensely satisfying. Innovatech had no choice but to agree to a very lucrative multi-year licensing agreement for my patents. The terms included a significant upfront payment and ongoing royalties that far exceeded any bonus I might have received from that farcical profit-sharing meeting. Suddenly, I wasn't just Sarah Chen, the quiet coder. I was Sarah Chen, a key patent holder whose technology was critical to the company's bottom line. The dynamic in the office changed overnight. The whispers followed me, but now they were tinged with awe and a healthy dose of fear. People who used to barely acknowledge my existence now went out of their way to say hello, to ask my opinion. Mark became a ghost. He was stripped of his lead role on the Phoenix Project, which ironically I was now asked to oversee directly, with a new title and a significant pay rise, separate from the patent income. He was eventually moved to a different department, working on some nebulous special projects, corporate Siberia. I heard he spent most of his time looking defeated. I didn't feel sorry for him. Henderson tried to extend an olive branch, a painfully awkward invitation to lunch to clear the air. I declined politely but firmly. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, but I prefer to keep our relationship strictly professional. The air, from my perspective, is quite clear. There would be no more false camaraderie, no more allowing them to think they could smooth things over with superficial gestures. I had established new boundaries, and they were made of steel, reinforced by patent law. The false apologies never came, not really. There were some mumbled regrets about misunderstandings from Henderson, but nothing that acknowledged the deliberate and sustained nature of their actions. It didn't matter. Their respect, or lack thereof, was no longer my concern. I had their attention, and I had their money, tied directly to the value I created. That was a language they understood far better than apologies. The power had shifted, decisively and permanently. I was no longer the invisible woman. I was the one holding the patent documents, and everyone knew it. Looking back on that whole saga, it's clear that this wasn't just about patents or profit sharing. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my value, in a system designed to diminish it. For years, I had allowed myself to be defined by their perception of me, the quiet, technically proficient workhorse who wouldn't make waves. I did my job, did it exceptionally well, and hoped that merit alone would be enough. It wasn't. The corporate world, or at least that corner of it, wasn't a pure meritocracy. It was a game, and Henderson and Mark were playing it by a set of rules that favored schmoozing, self-promotion, and the appropriation of others' labor. My revenge, if you can call it that, wasn't born out of malice, though the satisfaction of seeing their faces was undeniably sweet. It was born out of a desperate need for justice, for acknowledgement. It was the culmination of years of swallowed frustrations, of seeing my hard work attributed to others, of being made to feel small and insignificant. The patents were my way of speaking up, not with raised voice in a futile argument, but with the undeniable language of legal ownership. The true victory wasn't just the financial settlement, though that certainly provided a level of freedom and security I'd never known. It was the shift in how I saw myself, and consequently, how others were forced to see me. I learned that empowerment isn't given, it's taken. It's about understanding your worth, even when no one else seems to, and then finding the courage and the strategy to assert it. Dr. Hayes's advice was pivotal. She didn't just validate my skills, she pointed me towards the tools I needed to protect them. My journey taught me that being underestimated can be a peculiar kind of superpower, if you use that invisibility to quietly build your arsenal. While they were busy underestimating me, I was busy becoming undeniable. The world is full of Hendersons and Marks, people who will try to take credit, to diminish, to exclude. But it's also full of people like us, people with talent, dedication, and a deep-seated sense of fairness. I stayed at Innovatech for another year after everything settled, long enough to ensure the Phoenix project was stable under my actual leadership and to see the terms of my licensing agreement firmly established. Then I left, not because I was forced out, but because I chose to. I had the resources and the confidence to start my own consultancy, specializing in the very technology I had invented. I even occasionally consult for Innovatech, on my terms, at my rates. Dr. Hayes became a mentor and a friend, and we often laugh about the peacocks. This experience fundamentally changed me. I'm no longer the quiet woman who hopes her work will speak for itself. I ensure it does, but I also ensure my name is clearly attached and that its value is recognized from the outset. True empowerment, I've learned, is about knowing your worth, owning your contributions, and never, ever letting anyone else write your story for you or lock you out of the room where your success is being discussed. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight to get the credit you deserved, or where you were systematically undervalued? What steps did you take, or what do you wish you had done? Share your stories and your own reflections in the comments below. Your experience could be the very thing someone else needs to hear to find their own strength. Let's build a community of support and shared wisdom. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next story of an underdog turning the tables and claiming their power. Remember, your value is inherent. Don't wait for others to recognize it. Demand it.